welcome back to Stephen King Month. Last week we took you to a trip back to Derry, Maine, and I haven't yet seen it as the recording of this video, but I am recording this video ahead of time because this week a future version of myself, or current version of myself when you watch this, is currently in Portland to a convention, Rose City Comic Con, and in speaking of comic books, I figure it is high time that we talk about a very familiar film in Stephen King's repertoire, and that is Creepshow. Creepshow is a 1982 film by the same name, and is directed by Verrill and was written by Stephen King, and it was one of the first, I think, anthology films that had a horror tinge, and it led to such creations as, Tales from the Crypt, as a TV show. It led to I think it was one of the main influences behind Trick or Treat, the Michael Dougherty Halloween type film that was created. And one of the things that the writer and director duo wanted to do was kind of make a film that's very much an homage to the 1950s pulp classic comic books that were horror filled, things that had terrifying tales and zombies and ghosts and monsters and whatnot. And nowadays, you don't really get a lot of monster-themed comic books unless you're in the independent scene or you're part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe with Blade or Morbius, things like that. And so when it came to this film from 1982, it was a pretty decent hit. I think it made almost about $400 million, or I don't know how much money it made, honestly. But yeah, so as I said before, this film is an anthology, and to judge an anthology is a little bit of a different take than something that is of a feature film or a straight-up adaptation. It's something that we would need to go short by short, so that's what we're going to do. Pulled out my notes, so I had to pull out my notes. So the first short on the whole entire film, the very thing that kind of like puts it all together is this sort of book-ended story where you have a father who's berating his son about reading a horror comic named Creepshow, the namesake of the entire movie, and he throws it out in the trash, and the entire film is connected. All the shorts that are presented are connected by this sort of animated, almost comic book-like animation style of the 80s, where it introduces each and every, anthology set. And then, the finale, was very interesting. I won't spoil it for those who have not seen the film, but let's just say it's actually pretty cool. It's a cool little reveal. But yeah, so let's go scene by scene. So the first scenario is called Father's Day, and it follows a rich, affluent family on the 7th anniversary of their grandfather's death, I want to say. And it kind of tells this tale of a woman who goes back to the grave every single year on Father's Day, the day that her father died, and kind of tries to pay respects, although the guy was kind of an asshole when he kept repeatedly asking for a cake. And they really make sure that you get annoyed by that. One of the main things that makes this film very unique is that it utilizes a lot of comic paneling, something that was utilized more in, like, say, Ang Lee's Hulk, even though I'm not a big fan of Ang Lee's Hulk. But at least, like, with Creepshow, it made sense because they were trying to adapt to the feel of reading through a comic book. And there's all that. The main thing about this one is that, when you get George A. Romero to direct an entire movie, of course at some point he's going to put a zombie in it. And the zombie work, all the creature effects in this film, by the way, were done by Tom Savini, who's a huge visual effects guy, a very huge, person in the industry. Very, very great visual effects guy. But anyway, Father's Day to me is just this kind of short film that, is about kind of a payback of not paying your relatives respect. I mean, yeah, sure, the grandfather, or the father in this case, was very over the top when it came to how he was behaving about his own cake.
It's Father's Day! Where's my cake? You promised me my cake! Bedelia, I'm your father, and you're supposed to be taking care of me.
I don't need you! I said I don't need you!
Bedelia, you bitch!
But when it comes down to it, I thought it was fine. Again, the creature effects work was really cool. I like the practicalness of it. I like the colors that are used towards the latter half of the short, and it really, like, a lot of that short section used comic paneling, or even like border walls for like all the little shots that they have. It's actually a pretty interesting short. Not necessarily my favorite out of the 5 that's presented in the film, but I thought it was pretty cool. Next up is probably the one that a lot of people remember, mostly because Stephen King's in it, and it's called The Lonesome Death of Jordy Verrill. So yeah, as I said before, Stephen King actually gets his acting chops into this film as this sort of farmer who finds this meteor that crashes down in his front lawn. It breaks, and he gets infected by this sort of grass virus, I guess. It's kind of a play, I think, on the Strange Color from Outer Space, or at least I think that's what the title is, from H.P. Lovecraft's story. There's a H.P. Lovecraft story about this color, this sort of weird color that's like changing the environment and like changing the food, and it's a weird story. I won't divulge too much into it. What made it fun for a lot of people in this case is the fact that Stephen King actually put 110% into his performance. Like, yeah, it's over the top, and I think it's really meant to be, especially with how it's directed in the sort of dream scenarios that Jordy Verrill actually has. Like, when he first finds the meteor, he thinks he's going to get $200 from the university, which I don't think is a thing. I mean, granted, it might be a thing that, like, universities pay people for getting, like, meteorites for their programs. I have no idea, honestly. It's been a while since I've been in college, probably about a year and a half. But then, like, once he starts getting, like, the virus and whatnot, he's dreaming of this, like, over-the-top, like, doctor who's very maniacal about chopping off his body parts and whatnot. It's honestly a really wacky segment. And again, not necessarily my favorite segment, but it's up there, honestly. I think it's probably one of the more lighthearted and hilarious ones, because it's like, you get Stephen King's weird acting chops, and you get this sort of weird just story. And also, at the end of this whole segment, there's a reference to Castle Rock, Maine, via, a road sign, which I thought was actually a really cool thing for Stephen King to do, just kind of like a little Easter egg. Of course, he couldn't put things like Derry, Maine into it because it wasn't even released. Like, as a book, it wasn't released. It would have been really interesting to have, like, Derry, Maine put into the story, but, this was released in 1982, the book came out in 1983, or 1983 to 1985. I'm a little bit iffy on when that book came out. And so the next segment is known for Leslie Nielsen's performance, and that is called Something to Tide You Over. Essentially, it follows Leslie Nielsen, who finds his wife's love affair, and he takes him out, and he pretty much kills both his wife and the guy that she was sleeping with via kind of this sort of sand to the neck on the beach as they're drowned to death. And this one's kind of interesting because I think it's a really fun... It's fun from a performance perspective because Leslie Nielsen has been known to play some really weird and very awesome villains in the past. And it's another trademark performance of his to be this over-the-top... not really over-the-top, but like just villainous. It's also a weird sort of tonal shift in the entire film because we've had, like, zombies, and then a meteorite that causes you to grow grass everywhere, and then we get to a murderous guy who gets haunted by the zombie ghosts of, you know, the people that he's killed. And it's also the one that's kind of the slowest pace. Like, I think out of the entire film, this very short was the longest paced thing in the whole world. This film is 2 hours long, and it felt like it was 30 minutes of the entire film. And most of it was just so... It was an oddly paced segment. But aside from that, it felt... I don't know. I had a little fun with this one. Not my favorite out of the whole thing. But, again, it still has Leslie Nielsen playing this really fun character. Granted, he's an asshole. Granted, he's the bad guy in this whole case. But yeah, I liked it. The second to last segment of this whole thing is called The Crate. The Crate follows this professor from a university who's having this trouble with his wife, and there's a discovery that's made at the university he works at where there's this crate underneath the staircase, which, by the way, has a reference to Carpenter in it, which is hilarious, and it's from the Arctic, you know. And essentially, in this crate is this monster that starts to eat people, and essentially, this kind of turns into this sort of murder, you know, cover-up type of short film by the end of it. The thing that makes it for me is that it utilizes a lot of reds and a lot of blues in terms of the shock reactions and whatnot. It uses a really fun little practical, you know, effect of the creature inside of the box. I like the gore that's utilized in it. Like, this guy gets slashed across the chest and you see, like, all the scar marks and whatnot. It's really cool and very well done for the 1980s, and I honestly think it still holds up. Although the one thing that doesn't really make it for me is that, you know, the first third of this whole short is just kind of a lot of backstory and filler, and it's just, you know, it wasn't very interesting, but it's not until we get to the stuff with the monster that it makes it more interesting, because by the time we have the monster killing people, and this guy pretty much, you know, kills his own wife via, you know, his, via the monster in the crate, you know, that's when it makes it interesting. But by the time that's over, you know, it's like, okay, I mean, that was a fun little short. And then the last segment of this whole thing is probably the most fucked up one, and it's called They're Creeping Up on You. And essentially, if you don't like cockroaches, if you have an innate fear of bugs in general, or if you're like, you know, a germ freak, you will hate this short. Because essentially, this follows a germophobic billionaire who lives in this sort of apartment building, I guess. He's devoided the entire apartment in bacteria, and he doesn't want cockroaches in his apartment building, and so he tries to rid him of it. But under some unexplained circumstances, a bunch of cockroaches start showing up in his apartment, and essentially he dies via cockroaches. And the way that he dies, how he dies, and how they show the effect is so gruesome. It honestly reminded me of, like, this scene from Poltergeist where this guy goes into this bathroom and starts, like, peeling his skin off. Like, it's almost to that same level of just gross out, like, death. And it's probably the most memorable of this entire thing because it's the last sort of shock of the film before we get to the, you know, the book ending of the entire Creepshow film. And it's just, you know, it's disturbing. You know, it's a very disturbing last story to really tell before you bookend the entire film with your, you know, overarching story. And let's actually talk about the overarching story for a second. It's not necessarily solely focused upon throughout the entire thing. It's not like we cut back to the family that's bookended the entire thing. but inside of these little segments that cut between the stories, you can actually tell that there is some foreshadowing. Like, at one point in the film, the pages flip through it, and you see, like, oh yeah, there's this voodoo doll, and there's this little coupon thing that was cut out. So it sort of sets up what's going to happen at the end of the entire film, which I entirely love. Now, is this film perfect? No. There is some questionable acting, and there's some pretty bland acting from some of the actors, to be honest. But when it comes to some of the performances in this film that give 100%, like Leslie Nielsen and Stephen King and, just a couple of other actors in here as well as the gore effects from Tom Savini, the creature effects by Tom Savini, the cinematography, the choices in editing. This is a very unique Stephen King film in the fact that, it really does, I feel, pay homage to the pulpy 1950s, 1960s horror comics that they grew up with. It's kind of the same way in how, Spider-Man as a Spider-Verse is a celebration of Spider-Man from the point of view of someone who's been with Spider-Man for the last, 30 years. Creepshow is the same thing. If you have not seen Creepshow, definitely do yourself a favor. Pick this up as soon as possible. If you are a fan of Stephen King, this is a very unique Stephen King film. It doesn't utilize a lot of his tropes, which is surprising, but it's, I think it's still good, honestly. The film itself did get 2 sequels that I will probably not review at any point during this month. The second one, yes, was continued by George Romero and Stephen King, respectively as director and writer. But the third film had nothing to do with Creepshow whatsoever. And it's honestly surprising that nowadays we are now getting a Shudder exclusive Creepshow series from Tom Savini, which honestly looks quite as good as the original Creepshow, if not a little better in terms of production quality. Like, it looks more crisp. It definitely has some of the same feel of the original movie. I'm actually genuinely curious as to what the Shudder series is going to be doing, but I'll be covering that, by the way, the Creepshow Shudder TV series. So stay tuned for that. But yes, I give Creepshow a recommendation rating of whatever. Just watch it, just watch it. But in all seriousness, I'm gonna give Creepshow a B+. Thank you guys so much for taking your time to watch my Creepshow review. This was an unconventional review in the fact that I had to review each segment of the entire thing. And next week we'll get more back on track with actually doing an actual review of a movie that's not an anthology. And for that, we have to go back to the origin point of Stephen King's whole career. See you next week.